Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, hi, I'm Fei, like Lubomir said. I'm really here to just introduce Olga and give a small introduction. The real title of our talk is Deep Analysis of Large-Scale Visual Recognition. Olga refused to put the word deep on it. So, we are basically the messengers. I think as all messengers go, their fate is uncertain. Sometimes they're the one who gets killed the first. But today we just want to share with you that what has history had proven to be a really exciting IMAGENET Challenge 2012. We want to share with you some of the deep analysis Olga has done, and also actually advertise and encourage you to participate in IMAGENET 2013, which is, I hope that more people will join us now. We have interesting results from last year. So, all right, so back to the fundamental quest of computer vision. So what do we want to do? One holy grail task in computer vision is to recognize objects in their natural environments. Like Jitendra just said, this is part of the big grand dreams of computer vision. It's not the only problem, but it's so essential to our human visual system, as well as any robotic visual system, that we've got to nail this problem down. So here's a backpack, and it's not easy, right? So as easy as this picture is, the backpack is in a cluttered environment. It's something you have never seen, so you have to deal with the appearances, the texture, the color, the shape. The viewpoint is also interesting. It's probably novel to you, at least for this particular backpack, yet you have to recognize it. In many cases, as a human, you have to recognize these objects really fast and really accurately. And as a robot or as a computer, if you don't recognize this, it's probably not an applicable algorithm. And the bad news doesn't stop here. The other layer to this problem, to this challenge, is that there are many object classes in this world. Just to name a few, to give you an example, they span from all kinds of things in the world. And think about all the problems, the variabilities, the challenges we have to face, you know, the color, the texture, and everything. So how many objects are there in the world? Where do we have to go to make computer vision really work and solve all these problems? The answer is we don't know. We don't know how many objects are there in the world, but we know this is going to be a large number. So that was part of our dream from my lab, as well as the collective community of computer vision, is that we need to solve this large-scale object recognition problem. So today, we're not going to talk particularly about any cool experiment we have done in this lab. We want to discuss with you that in order to do this, we need benchmarks. If we don't have reliable and challenging benchmarks, it's very hard to have a conversation across the community and among many researchers. And that is what has been happening as computer vision research matures in the past decade towards object recognition. So one of the most important and pioneering effort was by Mark Everham and his colleagues, mostly from Europe, is the Pascal VOC challenge. It happened for 7 years consecutively. Probably everybody here in the audience have heard of it. I also have seen that there are winners of Pascal challenges sitting in the audience. So the flagship challenge in Pascal VOC is the 20-class object detection problem. So the goal here is that you're presented with an image like that. You should be able to localize and label the 20 objects that Pascal challenge offered you. In this case, motorbike and person. There are other challenges like segmentation and so on, but that's outside of the scope of this talk. Well, Pascal is all good, but this number 20 does bug us. This is not the scope of problem that we are facing in daily life. Human visual system is way better than that. If you have to put a number, at least tens of thousands, if not more. The industrial applications and challenges that many of you are facing is an even bigger number. So that is what motivated our IMAGENET project. We wanted to take the problem of laboratory anecdotal, small number object recognition into a real world scale. This is not the real world, but we are trying to push this forward. So for the past 3 years, starting 2010, we have been holding the IMAGENET challenge, which is officially called Large Scale Visual Recognition Challenge, ILSVRC. So many of you know that the IMAGENET dataset itself consists of 22,000 objects and more than 15 million images. IMAGENET challenge, I'll just mostly focus on talking about 2012, which when history was made, is a smaller scope. It only involves 1,000 object classes, but that's a big step forward from Pascal, and totaling 1.4 million images. And here's an example of a particular image. So qualitatively, what is the difference between IMAGENET challenge data and Pascal? Here's one dimension to look at it. The variety of object classes is a lot bigger. So on the left, you see Pascal. So Pascal has a category called bird. IMAGENET challenge ILSVRC data has many categories, and there are flamingos, cocks, and quails, and so on. So there is much finer object categories. Another example, bottle. Pascal just has the entry-level category bottle, whereas we have pill bottles, beer bottles, wine bottles, and so on. So it was such as true also for car category. So IMAGENET challenge is a lot more fine-grained and contains a lot more variability. Another just a way to look at the data in IMAGENET challenge to familiarize you is that we also had done an analysis of the data on different dimensions in terms of the property of the objects and images. So they span from amount of texture. Well, let me just take a texture as an example. On the first row, you see the amount of textures for the different objects. And we ask humans to actually assess the intrinsic texture property of this object. And they range from very little texture, such as screwdriver, to a lot of texture, such as honeycomb. And the nice thing is we have this data quantitatively. We can do a lot of analysis. Another example is color. You can have objects such as coffee mugs that are not distinctive by color, whereas an object like red wine is almost defined by color. Shape is another dimension. We have objects that do not have distinctive shapes. Like jigsaw puzzle. We also have objects that have very distinctive shapes, like a bell. We have lots of big objects like airliners and cars. We also have lots of small objects like oranges and strawberries. So these are just give you an overview and a taste of what our data looks like. All right, so what was the ILSVRC 2012 challenge? There were actually 2 main tasks. There's a third one, which is called fine-grained. We're not going to talk about it. The 2 main tasks, the very first one is called classification task. This is the task that actually people have heard more about today. Most of Marco Aurelio's talk was about classification. The classic setup of classification task is the following. I give you an image. You have to make a binary decision of whether this image contains a steel drum or not. Okay? You don't have to tell me where the steel drum is. And so how did we evaluate? One of the challenges of IMAGENET challenge is that we have lots of data. And what does that mean? It means that to annotate every single object in every single image at that time, 2012 proven to be impossible. We just simply don't have that human and financial resource. So instead of, so the way we decided to evaluate is to look at your top 5 output, classifier output. So given that image, without the label clearly, if your output is on the left, and the top 5 labels is scale t-shirt, steel drum, drumstick, and mud turtle, one of them is the true label. You're considered correct. We allow you to, even if it's not the topmost label. Whereas if your output is on the right, even though drumstick is actually pretty close, you're considered wrong. Okay, so that is how we evaluate it. Quantitatively, if you participated in the entire challenge, your final number that enters into the competition is an aggregation of all of the images you had the correct top 5 output. Okay, so that number is judged, is collected from 100,000 testing images. Okay, so that's how the classification task is evaluated. We also, wait, one more thing. So what's the historical trend? Up till last year, classification task had happened 3 times, starting from 2010 to 2012. And the good news is, as a community, we're making progress. So the winning algorithm in 2010, LCC algorithm from NEC research, the score is 72.72%. And then the 2011, not too much has happened. And 2012, the big splash, everybody knows, we had a significant improvement. So, so that's the trend. We will analyze these numbers a little deeper later. Okay, let me just introduce you the second task, which for the rest of today's talk, we will focus on. And this is what we call classification localization task. Now your job is more challenging. You not only have to know there's a steel drum, you have to localize this correctly. So what does this mean to localize correctly under the ImageNet challenge evaluation last year? It means that you have to propose 5 bounding boxes, your top 5 bounding boxes. Each one has a label of the object you propose. And this is a perfect case scenario where the steel drum is correctly labeled as well as correctly boxed. Let me show you a not so ideal case. So if you correctly labeled steel drum, so you recognize there is such a thing in the image, but the localization is not good enough. And we use exactly the Pascal criteria for intersection over union. You're not given a correctness label for that output. Same thing, if you actually localized it well, but you didn't label it or classify it as the steel drum, you're also considered wrong. So this is a challenging task, but again, we take the top 5 label, top 5 choices and give you a little leniency in a way. So, okay, again, the accuracy is evaluated across all testing images. So that's the 2 tasks, and we only, this was the first time, the localization classification task was first time offered last year, 2012. So we don't have historical trend, but we have horizontal comparison. Olga will say more about the different teams. SuperVision, by now everybody knows, is Jeff and his students' neural network algorithm. It outperformed the second by quite a big margin. It's the Oxford VGG team. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand over the podium to Olga. The rest of the talk is about Olga's amazing analysis, deep analysis of what has happened. Let's just look a little closer into the performances and results from the VGG team versus the neural network team.
All right, thank you, Fei-Fei. All right, so we're going to look at what happens under the hood, and specifically, we're interested in what happens under the hood on classification plus localization. And I want to point out we have an ICCV paper coming up, and actually the PDF is online as of very early this morning, as well as we have a website with pretty pictures and all that stuff, so check it out. There's a lot more analysis than what we can talk about here. So in order to do this, we're going to start with a couple of preliminaries. So first, we're going to actually talk about a subset of the ILSVRC data, which is going to consist of 500 classes, and we're going to talk about why that's important. These are sort of the smaller classes. The classes with the smaller objects. We'll talk about it. I'm going to give a brief overview of the leading algorithms. And then we're going to look at sort of two parts of the analysis. One is we're going to look at what happens when you try to localize objects which are small in the image, appear in cluttered scenes. And the other one is what happens when you try to localize textured objects specifically. All right, so let's start with the first one. So ILSVRC, as Fei-Fei mentioned, sort of ranges from objects that may be easier to localize. So the canonical example is the t-shirt class, which in IMAGENET, a lot of the t-shirt images are very large and centered and kind of very, very easy to classify and sort of trivial to localize because you just say, oh, the whole image is a t-shirt. Great, done, you got it. Ranging to hard to localize, which is steel drum, is sort of one of the actually hardest categories. It tends to be very small in the image. So what we're going to do for the purpose of this analysis, we're just going to focus on the 500 object classes, which are the classes with the smallest object. The object appears at the smallest scale. And the reason why we're going to do that is because this is actually going to make this data set kind of similar to Pascal according to several statistics. So for example, you can look at the object scale, so the fraction of the image area that's occupied by the object. And in this ILSVRC 500 data set, we have 500 object categories, and on average, the objects occupy about 25% of the image. And this is actually similar to what happens on the Pascal data set, and Pascal is sort of the gold standard in object detection these days. So this sort of helps us to normalize and avoid the question of, oh, but there are some categories where the objects are big and the images. Indeed, so here we're just going to focus on these 500. And in fact, we can look at several other sort of measures of difficulty, one being we define something called the chance performance of localization. So here we say, OK, so let's again consider steel drum images. We have a bunch of images and a bunch of instances of steel drums labeled. So we have bounding boxes from B1 up to B9. And we define the chance performance of localization as sort of what happens if you take any one of these bounding boxes and then use it to localize in all of the other images. So we sort of put all the bounding boxes together and we say, OK, if we take bounding box 1, how many of the other bounding boxes can we localize? And this helps to account, it's not just sort of whether your object is big or small, but how sort of scattered is it around the images. Because if it's small but always appears in the center, that's trivial to localize. You just always localize to the center. So this helps us sort of measure the distribution of objects. And again, here we're pretty similar to Pascal. We're about 8.4, so actually slightly more difficult in this sense. And Pascal is at about 8.8. And the final measure that we can use is measure of clutter. And there's sort of several ways to define and to measure clutter in images. So what we do is we actually take the work from ICCV 2011 called Selective Search for Object Detection. And it's a method for proposing class invariant object regions. So it sort of says, OK, in this image, I think the object can appear like, the following regions are likely to contain objects. So you can use that to propose a bunch of potential object windows. You can filter out the regions that fall actually inside your object or that correctly localize your instance, and you can count the rest. And this is one possible way to measure clutter. And again, here we have about 128 regions per image on average, and Pascal VOC has about 130, so sort of similar levels of clutter as well. OK. So let's talk about some of the leading algorithms from this year's challenge. So as you know, SuperVision, which we're going to abbreviate SV for the rest of the talk, is Alex Krzyzewski's work from Jeff Hinton's lab. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. It's sort of important to get a vague sense of it, but there's also a great NIPS paper about it if you want to know all the details. But it's basically for image classification to build a large, deep convolutional neural network. They have 7 hidden layers with many, many neurons, many, many parameters, 630 million connections, 60 million parameters. It's this huge thing. Consists of rectified linear units with max pooling and with the dropout trick, which is sort of the new cool regularization technique. And they use all of the training data, 1.2 million images for this challenge, as well as sort of sample for more data to make it more large scale. Trained on 2 GPUs for a week in a fully supervised way. And for localization, what they do, so the model is trained specifically for image classification. For localization, what they do is they do regression on x, y, width, and height coordinates. And this is important because it's important to keep in mind as we talk about classification with localization. So this team did the best on classification with localization, even though sort of arguably the localization method, it's not that great. It can only handle 1 instance per image. It's not the standard kind of sliding window where you could consider classifying every window. No, this is just a fairly simple localization method. This is something important to keep in mind. And the second place team is the Oxford VGG team, which we're going to call VGG for the rest of the talk. So this is a more sort of standard canonical image classification pipeline, if you will. So it has Fisher vectors and a linear SVM. And it uses sort of the, I guess, the standard computer vision features that you would think of. So it has SIFT, it has some color statistics, does product quantization. They actually mine some of the ImageNet data for additional bounding boxes as well. It's a 1 versus rest SVM. And for localization, they use the sort of state-of-the-art, discriminatively trained part space models, so the deformable part space model, which has been, was published in PAMI 2010, but has been the default object detection method. So that's what they do for localization. They sort of, I can go into the details, but basically they combine the 2 methods, and then they use the part space model to propose the bounding box. All right. So now that we have the preliminaries out of the way, so let's take a look at the analysis. So we're going to first look at what happens when you try to localize small objects. And on the ILSVRC 500, so even though this is just a subset of the data, still SuperVision significantly outperforms VGG. It's not by as much as when you consider all 1,000 categories, but it's still quite a large margin. So let's consider for a second, so in classification with localization, there's sort of 2 components. One is do you get the label correct, and one is do you localize the image. So we're going to consider for a second just classification only. So in this case, so Feifei talked about sort of how if you get the label correct, but you don't get the bounding box, this counts as a false, as an inaccurate localization. But for a second, we're actually going to count this as correct. As long as you get the label correct, we're going to count it. So we can plot on the x-axis, we can plot object scale. On the y-axis, we have the difference in classification accuracy between SuperVision and VGG. And each dot corresponds to 1 object class. So there's 500 dots here corresponding to the 500 object classes. And we can color this plot, and we see that, well, SuperVision actually does better than VGG on almost all of the object classes. So 452 out of the 500 object classes, it gets classification. It has a higher classification accuracy than VGG. And what's interesting now is, and you can look at some of the pretty pictures as well. Of course, you want to look at the pretty pictures. So you can look at some of the categories where SV beats VGG, which is more or less on almost all of them. And it beats it by a huge margin, by 0.69% in accuracy on some of these categories. And VGG does outperform. So for example, microwave is the one category where it outperforms SV with statistical significance. And I guess we can talk about it later, but it's because microwaves actually have a very, very distinctive shape. So they're, in some sense, sort of very well suited to the hog template type representation of the deformable parts model. So now, when you talk about classification with localization, you actually get quite a different plot. So you can, again, plot object scale on the x-axis, classification plus localization accuracy, sort of the difference between the two algorithms on the y-axis. And now you see a very different pattern. So actually, first of all, SuperVision doesn't win on as many object classes. But second of all, you actually can notice this sort of upward trend. So on classes which have smaller scale, objects that are smaller in the image, or classes that tend to have images where the target object is smaller than the image, VGG actually seems to do better. And one other way of visualizing is you can plot cumulative accuracy across scales. So again, on the x-axis is object scale, on the y-axis is the cumulative accuracy. So sort of at each point, the height of the graph is, if we take all object categories where the average object scale is that or smaller, and we compute the accuracy of the two algorithms, that's the height of your graph. Yeah, so for classification, no matter what subset of categories you choose, pretty much SuperVision will outperform. Whereas on classification with localization, there's sort of this point where they cross. And this point is about object scale of 0.24. And if you consider sort of the 205 smallest object classes, 205 object classes where the object is the smallest in the image, you just consider those, actually VGG does better in this realm than SuperVision. And so you shouldn't read too much into this. So again, like I mentioned before, the SuperVision system is not actually super carefully tuned to do detection. It's sort of a classification-based system, and it's already really impressive that it does so well on localization. But indeed, it's kind of interesting to point out that when you're looking at just the smallest objects, VGG actually appears to be stronger. All right, so the summary, SV, always great at classification. VGG tends to be better at localizing small objects. And we're going to ask why. And here, again, so I can only speculate, right? It's hard to exactly say why, but one of the reasons may be that because of the way it does localization. Although another potential reason, it still remains to be seen whether or not if you, say, do it in a sliding window fashion, whether or not it will actually outperform VGG and similar methods, or if there's something fundamentally that's not suited for detection. I think the vote is still out on that one. Okay, so let's quickly take a closer look now at textured objects. So again, as Feifei mentioned, one of the things you can do is for every object class in ImageNet, you can annotate it with how sort of textured it is. And you can do this with human annotators. You can ask them, okay, how distinct, on a screwdriver, how distinctive is the texture? On a honeycomb, how distinctive is the texture? And you can, for each of the 500 object classes, or we did it actually for all 1,000, but here we're talking about the 500, we can get these annotations. And so you can count the number of classes for each of the 4 different bins. And so if we're going to analyze performance, and we just talked about how scale is super important, what you want to do is you want to make sure that the object scale is sort of the same in each bin. And here we look that actually the objects that are highly textured tend to be bigger in the images. So there's several reasons for it. One is that there's a lot of dogs in this data set, and actually the dogs tend to be quite big in the image, and they tend to also be highly textured. But anyway, so first, before we do anything else, we actually want to normalize for object scale in each of the bins. So now instead of 500 classes, we're looking at just 416 classes, but in each of the 4 bins with the 4 different levels of texture, we have the same object scale. So the effects we're seeing here are not the result of different object scale. Yes?
How did you decide the different bins by hand?
So we got, I think, 3 human annotators per each object class, and we sort of asked them how distinctive is the texture. It's not perfect, but yeah, it was human annotated. All right, so we have the 4 different levels of texture, 416 classes, and we can look at the performance of SV and VGG. So right away we notice that objects with more texture have higher accuracy. So both of these algorithms, when you look at objects with more texture, they do better. They're better at localizing them. OK, so both take advantage of texture, great. The next question is, OK, what happens when you consider just the images which were correctly classified? So if we want to say, OK, so fine, texture might make it easier to classify the image as well. OK, so now we're going to just look at images which were correctly classified. And we're going to see whether on those images the algorithm localizes the object correctly or not. And here, it's actually very interesting. So for VGG, across all the different levels of texture, if the object was correctly classified, about 65% of the time, it'll be correctly localized. On SuperVision, however, for sort of untextured objects, it's also about the same as VGG. If it was correctly classified in sort of, oh, I guess in the, sorry, on this subset, it's actually lower. But if it was correctly classified, sort of in about 60% of the cases, it'll be correctly localized. But for the very textured objects, actually a higher percentage get correctly localized if it was correctly classified, which is sort of an interesting trend, and it's an interesting distinction between the two algorithms, which may imply something about the underlying methods. And so we conclude that, so first, textured objects tend to be easier to localize, but especially this is true for SuperVision. And we can speculate that possibly the reason for this is that, well, so VGG models shape quite well and relies on sort of other cues other than texture. SuperVision seems to have a very, very strong texture model and seems to somehow have built a very, very good texture model and seems to derive a lot of benefit from that, a lot of bandwidth from that, which is interesting, something worth considering. Yes, OK. So these are two sort of small pieces of analysis. There's a lot more in the paper, so go check that out. And one thing that sort of is worth mentioning, here we were doing classification with localization. So Fabio was talking about the top 5, the top 5 metric for evaluation, how we couldn't annotate all of the objects and all of the images. But really, we should be able to do that. And for this year, for ILSVR 2013, we actually went ahead and annotated 200 object classes across 60,000 images. So we actually want to do detection, not just classification with localization. That was great. That was fun. We learned lessons from it. But this year, we're actually going to be doing actual large-scale detection. And we can evaluate generic object detection, cluttered scenes at scale. So this is our challenge for this year, which we're very excited about. We can compare it in terms of scale to Pascal. We can also compare it actually in terms of various other image statistics. It's actually a very challenging data set. It's also, so there's about 10 times more classes than in Pascal. There's about 25 times more training images, about 4 times more validation and test images. There's a lot of person instances annotated for those of you who are interested in people detection in particular. And these are a lot of sort of incidental people images and all sorts of different scenes and scenarios. And so we're just going to conclude by advertising this challenge for this year. So there's been about 159 downloads so far. It's due on November 15th with a corresponding workshop at ICCV. And just as the last thing we're going to mention, so for the challenge this year, we're actually looking at sort of basic level categories. So we sort of stepped a little bit away from the localizing each of the different type of birds and sort of treating each of the different dogs separately. Now we just have a lot of basic level categories, 200 basic level categories. But if you're still excited about fine-grained classification, there's actually a fine-grained challenge that's happening in conjunction with ILSVRC this year, which we highly recommend you participate in as well. All right. There are some acknowledgements. Thank you. Are there questions? Yeah?
I was wondering if you have compared the two methods and gather any statistics in comparing how the classification performs when you look at the taxonomy of the data structure. So essentially, say a cat, so Dalmatian dog gets confused with the shepherd versus with the screwdriver.
Yes, that's a great question. So that's section 3.1 of our paper. That was part of the analysis that got cut out of this talk, unfortunately. Yes, so we don't explicitly look at confusion matrices between them, but what we do is we say, okay, suppose we relax the requirement that sort of you have to get the exact right label. So what happens when you are allowed to get just the dog label instead of the exact one? Yeah, a lot of the trends still holds. A lot of very similar trends holds. You can clearly see, so SuperVision is very good at fine-grained classification. It's really good at fine-grained classification. The two algorithms sort of tend to catch up fairly quickly. So once you move to basic level categories, the gap between them becomes smaller than at the fine-grained scale. But yes, that's sort of one of the insights you can get out of that. But yes, there's definitely that analysis.
Doesn't have enough pixels to work with because they have very good texture model, but seems like the size to 224 is not having enough resolution. Do you think that's possibly a reason, or have you looked at to expand to the bigger size or something like that?
Can you repeat the question, please?
That's interesting. Repeat the question.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Looks like the neural network-based one doesn't have enough pixels to work with because Annex resize the image into 224. I think that's pretty small for small objects. So I think, or at least in my intuition, if you double the size or have the full resolution to work with, that could improve the result pretty dramatically.
That's a great question. So we download images from Flickr. When people post higher resolution pictures to Flickr, we download higher resolution pictures. So we don't do any resizing. So we download from Flickr, we annotate, and then we release the original full resolution. So yes, that may very well be true. As cameras get better and people upload higher resolution pictures to Flickr, we'll have higher resolution data for the challenge.
I believe Annex working to resize the image, not in your size. I think your dataset have
Resolution 640 or 512. Annex still reduce that into 224, so that's even smaller images to work with. So that probably handicap neural network approach quite a bit.
Yeah, that's possible. That's possible. Yep.
Have you looked at the effect of the training set and computation size of these things? Because it could be that once you multiply the data set size by 1,000 or by orders of magnitude more, then the slope will just keep going up, and all these issues will go away.
Once you multiply. Yeah, that's possible. So we don't have access to the sort of original, like what you're suggesting is basically train on half of the data set, see what happens. Yeah, so we don't have access to the original system, so the authors of those systems would have to do that. Like we take their submission to the challenge and we aggregate scores over the different classes and then we sort of analyze that. But yeah, I think that's a great question, and hopefully the scale of the challenges will grow, and then maybe sort of over the years we can track that.
So I really like the slide about comparing the different levels of texture. I think that's a very neat one. Can you go back there? So the left, before with the little lines, yeah.
With
so
the lines.
So the left side makes a lot of sense to me that the deep learning is able to deal better with the textured objects. But my intuition would be that VGG, basically hog-based representation, should go down as the objects become more and more textured. For example, we know that hogs don't deal with things like hairy dogs and cats and stuff like this as well. And yet here it seems to be staying still. Do you have an explanation for this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we've done also analysis on things like deformable versus non-deformable objects, and actually VGG tends to stay pretty consistent on deformable versus non-deformable as well. Yeah, I don't think I have an answer sort of off the top of my head for you why it would go down. This is, so they're using, so it's not just a DPM model, right? So they have all of the sort of coded Fisher vector features on top, and what they do is they use so I think they do full image classification, get a top list of candidate sort of classes that they think it might be, then they run DPM to localize, and then they reclassify it with that model. So I think there's sort of, it's more than just a standard DPM model that may be part of it.
Last question.
Does VGG do a pyramid?
Does VGG do a
Do they do a spatial pyramid when they're doing the histogram?
Yeah,
So if you're downsampling the image, you probably get rid of a lot of the textures. That could be why they're not affected by the texture, because the SVM is just doing better on the downsampled image.
That's true.
It's smooth.
That's true. That's a very good point.
Let's thank our speaker.